All right, welcome to the ultimate high-speed board exam sprint explainer. I'm your host, and today I'm basically putting on my academic coaching hat. Look, if you're staring down your syllabus right now and feeling, well, totally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of social studies material, I want you to just take a deep breath. We are going to rapidly tackle these massive chapters together. We're locking in the absolute most important details and filtering out the noise so you can focus on exactly what you need to know. So get your mental running shoes on because we are moving fast. Here's our sprint syllabus for today. We're racing through 5 crucial checkpoints, starting with economics and measuring true development. Then we jump over to history for Indian nationalism, followed by geography to classify Earth's resources. After that, we're swinging back into economics for sectors, GDP, and employment. And finally, we'll finish up with a sprint to France for the Napoleonic Code. Let's go.
All right, Section 1, Measuring True Development.
Okay, let's dive right in. How do we actually figure out if a country is developed? Like, what's the math there? Well, a super basic metric is national income. You literally just calculate it by adding up the total income of every single resident in a country. Simple, right? But wait, total income can be really misleading. I mean, what if one country just has a massive population compared to another? Of course their total will be higher. That's exactly why looking at per capita income, which is just the average income per person, is a much more accurate metric for comparison. And actually, that brings us perfectly to how major global organizations judge world development. Now check out the stark contrast between these two global reports. On the left, we've got the World Bank, and they take a purely money-focused approach. They look at per capita income, and that's it. If your country averages over $3,400 per person, boom, you're considered high income or rich. But look over at the right side. The UNDP's Human Development Index, they take a much broader approach. They realize, money isn't everything. So they add life expectancy and literacy rates into the mix. Because they're actually measuring human well-being, their rankings yield some pretty wild surprises. Like Switzerland sits at number 1, and surprisingly, Sri Lanka actually ranks ahead of India, which is currently sitting at 130. Crazy, right?
All right, let's pause for our first rapid practice question. Test your active recall right now. How does the UNDP's Human Development Index differ from the World Bank's Development Report? Got your answer? The key here is that while the World Bank is strictly focused on average income, the UNDP brings in those critical metrics of life expectancy and literacy rate to gauge actual, real human development.
Moving on to Section 2, Indian Nationalism and Movements.
Fantastic start. Now, let's leave economics for a second and sprint back in time to history. To really understand the rise of Indian nationalism, we have to look at the immense pressure India was under during World War I. This brilliantly illustrates this devastating cocktail of crises that hit the country all at once. The British introduced new income taxes and massively increased defense spending, just completely draining the economy. They initiated forced recruitment, literally making Indians fight a war that wasn't even theirs. Add to that severe crop failures and famines between 1918 and 1921, and then layer on a horrific influenza pandemic that killed 1.2 crore, or 12 million people. This perfect storm of disease, economic drain, and forced military service, it fueled absolute outrage among the Indian population. So the British saw all this anger bubbling up and they panicked. In 1919, they passed the Rowlatt Act. This was a deeply oppressive law designed specifically to crush personal liberty and just squash any budding national movement. But, as you can guess, this act was a massive catalyst for resistance. Mahatma Gandhi, who had just returned to India in 1915, stepped up to lead, and he launched his Satyagraha movements. Now, this wasn't just your standard protest. It was an incredibly powerful, strict method relying purely on truth and non-violence. He was basically proving you could fight injustice without ever laying a finger on your opponent. Okay, pause for our second checkpoint question. Let's see what you remember. Why did Mahatma Gandhi initiate the early Satyagraha movements specifically in Champaran and Kedah? Think about it. The answer? Both of these early protests were actually fought for farmer rights against totally oppressive colonial agricultural demands. In Champaran, it was for farmers forced to grow indigo, and in Kedah, for farmers devastated by crop failure and the plague.
Great job! Now, Section 3, Classifying Earth's Resources.
You guys are keeping up perfectly. Let's jump over to geography and break down exactly what makes something a resource. It's so tempting to think that anything just sitting out there in nature is automatically a resource, but it's really not. It has to pass 3 golden rules. First, it must be technologically accessible. Like, aluminum has always been in the earth, but until we actually had the tech to extract it from bauxite, it wasn't a resource. Second, it's got to be economically feasible, meaning extracting it has to yield a profit, right? It can't cost you more than it's actually worth. And third, it must be culturally acceptable by the society or region. So, bottom line, a piece of nature, like a deposit of underground oil, isn't a true resource until it confidently checks all three of those boxes.
Once we know what a resource is, we have to classify them based on exhaustibility. This is a simple but absolute must-know exam concept. Renewable resources, like solar energy, are constantly being replenished by nature. They aren't going anywhere. Non-renewable resources, though, like fossil fuels and petrol, they are entirely fixed in quantity. They took literally millions of years to form, and once they're used up, that's it. They are gone for good.
All right, take a breath. Section 4, Sectors, GDP, and Employment.
Moving right along to our densest checkpoint yet, we're diving back into economics to untangle the three economic sectors, how GDP works, and where everyone actually finds employment. So let's break the economy down into these three distinct sectors. First, you have the primary sector. This extracts raw materials straight from nature, like agriculture and mining. Next, the secondary sector takes those raw materials and converts them into finished products. Think of your capital-intensive manufacturing layer. Finally, the tertiary sector provides services rather than producing physical goods, so transport, banking, teachers, IT. Now keep in mind how highly interdependent these all are, because without primary raw materials from farmers or tertiary transport trucks to move the goods, those secondary manufacturing factories, they would completely grind to a halt.
So, let's see how all this builds into GDP, or gross domestic product. Calculating GDP is all about one major rule: avoiding double counting. Let's trace a quick timeline to see what I mean. A farmer grows wheat for 10 rupees. A mill grinds it into flour for 20. A factory bakes a raw biscuit for 40. And finally, a shop sells the packaged final biscuit to a consumer for 50 rupees. When the National Statistical Office actually calculates GDP, we only count that final 50 rupee biscuit value. Why? Well, because that 50 rupees inherently includes the value added at every single previous intermediate step. If we added the 10, the 20, the 40, and the 50 all together, we'd literally be counting the exact same wheat 4 times. Make sense?
Now, let's contrast the actual working conditions within the economy. There is an incredibly stark divide between the organized versus the unorganized sector. The organized sector offers safety. It strictly follows formal regulations like the Factory Act, offers fixed working hours, and provides crucial benefits: insurance, sick leave, paid maternity leave. We're usually talking about government jobs or corporate roles here. On the flip side, the unorganized sector is incredibly vulnerable. They aren't bound by formal rules, their hours are irregular and exhausting, and they have absolutely zero benefits or job security. This includes millions of street vendors and house helps who are just entirely unprotected.
And because of that immense vulnerability in the unorganized sector, especially in rural areas where farming is super seasonal, the government has to step in. Which brings us to MGNREGA, passed in 2005. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is a direct government intervention designed to solve rural disguised unemployment. It legally guarantees 100 days of paid employment to rural households, directly supporting the fundamental right to work. And get this, if they can't provide the work, they actually have to pay an unemployment allowance. It's a massive, massive safety net.
Time to test yourself once more with a classic exam contrast. Which economic sector employs the most people in India, and which sector contributes the most to the country's GDP? Got it? You need to remember this exact split. The primary sector, mostly agriculture, provides the most jobs. However, it's the tertiary sector, the services industry, that brings in the most money and contributes the highest share to the national GDP. Don't mix those two up.
All right, home stretch. Section 5, the Nepalanya Code.
You guys are doing amazing. We've officially reached our final sprint checkpoint, taking us across the borders and back in time to France in 1804. Napoleon completely overhauled the French administration. He divided the country into 130 departments and introduced the Napoleonic Code, implementing 5 massively popular unifying reforms. Check these out. He completely removed all societal privileges based on birth, establishing true equality before the law and securing property rights. He abolished restrictive guilds, which opened up the market and really helped consumers. He standardized weights, measures, and created a common currency to make trade seamless across different regions. And, incredibly importantly, he abolished the oppressive feudal system, finally freeing peasants from serfdom.
Now, the people initially welcomed him with flowers for these brilliant reforms, but there was a dark side to his rule. The public soon turned against him when they started feeling the harsh, oppressive limitations of his power. See, Napoleon was totally obsessed with expanding his empire through endless wars. To fund all this, he imposed heavy taxation on the citizens. He implemented strict censorship, basically throwing anyone who spoke against him in jail. And worst of all, he enforced forced conscription, demanding that young Frenchmen join his military campaigns to go fight and die for his personal ambitions.
And that brings us to the end of our rapid revision. But before you go, I want to leave you with this final, provocative historical question to chew on. Considering both his brilliant, unifying administrative reforms and the incredibly oppressive, costly limitations of his rule, was Napoleon ultimately a liberator or an oppressor? Think about how you'd argue that in an exam setting. Congratulations on completing this ultimate sprint, focused learners. Keep practicing these concepts, rely on your active recall, and you are absolutely going to crush those boards. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.